Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Grace Kao, who is Professor of Sociology and Faculty Director of Education Studies at Yale University. She studies race, ethnicity, and immigration as they collectively relate to education and relationships among young people. She is also interested in the effects of migration on young people and has written papers on these topics in Mexico, China, and Spain. Her work has been published in numerous scholarly publications, and according to Google Scholar, it's been cited more than 8,000 times. Today, we'll talk with Professor Kao about her research on the spousal age gap in cross-border marriages. Welcome, Professor Kao.
Thank you.
So let's talk about the paper that you wrote that was just published in Population and Development Review. Give us an overview of it.
Sure. So it looks at cross-border marriages. So these are marriages between folks that are not citizens of the U.S. and folks who are citizens of the U.S.
Okay.
So what's interesting is that sociologists and other demographers and social scientists have long looked at marriage patterns of immigrants, so after they arrive to the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
What we know less about really is whether marriage becomes an impetus for migration. So we know in the popular media there are couples that meet abroad and also people that perhaps travel abroad for the purpose of meeting a spouse. So we were interested in basically how marriage and timing of migration overlap with each other.
Okay, so you're looking at what countries specifically? So,
so
people coming from Mexico
No,
or Canada?
This is from the United States, and this
Okay.
is people coming from anywhere.
Anywhere.
Yeah,
okay.
so there are analyses in the paper that look at regional differences, but the primary goal was to look at how citizenship status overlap with the timing of marriage, and then also whether there's a different age gap depending on where spouses meet, essentially.
Okay, interesting. So what led you to be interested in this?
So my co-authors, Kelly Stamper Balistreri and Kara Joyner, and I are working on a book on interracial romance and friendship among youth.
Okay.
So for that paper, or that book rather, we're looking at a cohort, a group of people who were 7th to 12th graders, and we look at how their relationships in adolescence link to their relationships in young adulthood. So that's a different project, and that's a project we've been working for a long time on. Mm-hmm. In that conversation, we were reading lots of media reports about interracial relationships, and also there's a lot of ethnographic accounts and popular media accounts of folks that travel abroad. You know, we've all heard of mail order brides and so
Right.
forth. So that got us in sort of on a different topic. Mm-hmm. And Kelly was really smart and figured out a way to look at the timing of marriage and migration. And so we thought, could we find folks that met abroad and perhaps came to the U.S. after marriage and immediately after marriage. And so that's how we started. And so I want to give a lot of credit to Kelly Balistreri, who really figured out how to deal with this in terms of data issues.
Okay, and let's talk about the methodology. How did you,
Sure.
how did you do the research for the paper?
Yeah, so we used the American Community Survey, which is essentially something collected by the U.S. Census. Mm-hmm. It's equivalent to the long form that we had in the census before. So the census that everyone takes is pretty short and doesn't have a lot of information. Mm-hmm. So the long form has more questions about foreign-born status, timing of migration, how long people had been in the U.S., and so forth. So we were able to do this. And the sample we used had 90,000 women who were married. We had to look at people who are married, and 75,000 men who are married.
Okay.
So it's
wow,
a naturally,
it's interesting that it was more women than men.
Oh, sure. There are, right.
Okay.
It's partly because we narrowed it by age.
Okay.
So because if you sort of expand the age range, you hit different historical periods. So there are people who were GIs, perhaps during the Korean War, who met their spouses that way. And so we wanted to constrain the historical period because there's a lot of events that occur that might drive these things. So we wanted to be able to tell a clean story.
Okay, so what time period are you looking at?
Well, so these folks were 17 or 18 rather to 35, and they had to be married within the last 10 years.
Okay. All right, so what roles do age and citizenship play in the equation?
Yeah, so what we found is that men and women, so a U.S. citizen man, and we only looked at different sex marriages in this paper, a U.S. citizen man who marries a non-citizen woman abroad, either before the woman migrates or in the same year, those couples have an average age gap about 7 years. So the man is about 7 years on average older than the woman.
Okay.
When we look at couples, so non-citizen women that are married to citizen men but married after the woman migrated, that gap is 3 years. Okay. And then if we look at non-citizen women who marry someone who's a non-citizen man in the U.S., the gap is 1 year.
Okay.
So there's the gap is really quite large. And if you look at from the point of view of men, so non-citizen men who are married to U.S. citizen women abroad, the gap is 3 years, or sorry, the gap is less than 1 year. So husbands are only a little bit older than women. And then if you look at non-citizen women who are married to citizen men but married in the U.S. after a year or more of arrival, the gap is 2 years. And so again, so even for non-citizen men, they have to marry a woman not older than them, but the age gap is smaller. So it looks like both men and women are doing some kind of trade, but the gap is largest for the women that are traveling from abroad.
So you mentioned the word trade. What is being traded?
Right. So we argue that, again, previous research really looks at what happens after people arrive to the U.S. These are women by definition and men who do not have citizenship status.
Okay.
When you marry someone who is a U.S. citizen, it is much easier to eventually become, a permanent resident, and then that's a path to citizenship.
Right.
So we're arguing, even though we can't measure it directly, that women who marry a U.S. citizen prior to coming to the U.S., that this is a faster route to becoming a U.S. citizen. So, you could imagine that if you come to the U.S., okay, so let's say you marry someone from abroad, and that person is also not a U.S. citizen, right? So you're both in the same boat, to speak, right?
Sure.
So anyhow, so that's what we can capture. We can't, it's essentially data that's like the U.S. Census, so we're not talking to individuals. We can't measure their actual motivations. All we can do is look at the timing of these events. But we can say this, it's nationally representative. So what we're saying is true for the entire U.S. population.
Okay, and in terms of people coming in from other countries, did you track that at all?
So
where they're coming from specifically?
So we looked at the region of the world. We tried to do this by country too, but the numbers of people get kind of small. But we found very big variations. And so the patterns we found are actually consistent with some of the media accounts. So foreign-born brides who meet their spouses before coming to the U.S. or in the same year as coming to the U.S. Ones from Southeast Asia, the age gap is 10 years. Okay. So they're marrying men that are on average 10 years older. Russia is the next highest region, and that's about 8 years. Okay. And so compare that to someone who, let's say, from Canada, who might meet their spouse abroad, and that gap is 2 or 3 years. So that's much like the gender gap in marriage among people that are already in the U.S. Right? On average, men marry women that are a couple years younger.
Okay.
So yeah, so it's a big difference.
Right, yeah. So how about, I'm interested in women who are citizens
Yes.
marrying men
Yes.
from outside the country.
It's
Talk
so,
about that.
It's so interesting because at first we didn't really think about them, right? So the stereotype is men are traveling abroad and perhaps for the purpose of meeting women. But we found also a gender difference. Again, it's not to the point where women, citizen women are marrying younger men, but that gap is much smaller. So they're essentially marrying a man that's just about a year younger. And of course, again, the differences are not big, but that's compared to, I think on average, non-citizen men that marry a non-citizen woman after arrival. So let's say you're from China and you're a single man, you come to the US, you meet another non-citizen, let's say from China also.
Okay.
So that kind of couple, the difference is, I think about 3 years.
Okay.
So that's much like the patterns we see for the general public
Right.
in the US, and that's
Okay.
kind of a standard gender norm.
Interesting. So really, there isn't really much of an age gap until you have men marrying women from outside the country.
Right, and specifically from certain regions of the country.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So did anything surprise you while you were doing the research?
I think sometimes for folks like me who are quantitative researchers, we read a lot of interesting media accounts of events and patterns. And then when we dig through the data, if we have data that is sort of parallel to that, those kinds of patterns, often we don't find much because there are lots of interesting stories that might emerge when you talk to a couple of people.
Right.
But when you look at the national population, there might not be much happening. So actually, we were surprised that our findings were so consistent with the media accounts and with there have been documentary films following folks who travel abroad to meet people. So we were surprised actually to find that's a really big difference.
Right, interesting. So are you going to be looking at this same group of people down the road in terms of divorce rates, for instance, or is there going to be any kind of a follow-up?
That's a great question. For some data sets, there are large longitudinal components where they follow the same group of people over time. And for our book, that's what we're doing, that we have a data set with lots of young people, and we can follow them over time. It's data collected by other folks. But with US Census kinds of data, you can't do that. It's not longitudinal, so it's just a snapshot of the US population at one point in time. So we could look at, in 10 or 20 years, whether the regional patterns hold or whether the age gap shrinks or grows, but we can't say anything specifically about these people.
I understand, okay. And then, so what do you conclude in your paper?
So we conclude that there is evidence, especially for non-citizen women and citizen men that meet abroad, that there is some kind of exchange between a more youthful partner, so youthful bride, for men that are citizens. I forgot to say this, that also these men tend to be older than the typical men who are married. They tend to be more likely to be on their second or higher order marriage.
Okay.
So it's a very distinct population that travels, or maybe they don't travel, but they are abroad when they meet their partner.
Okay. All right, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for speaking with me.
For more information about Professor Cao and her research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.